but important. We also thank you for providing the Security Council with a very valuable text. We have voted in favor of the draft resolution. We deeply regret that the draft could not be adopted due to a veto. In voting in favor, Mozambique wishes to express our deep concern over the outbreak and escalation of violence and deterioration of the situation in Gaza, and consequently, the unfolding humanitarian crisis. Moreover, we are deeply concerned about the human lives that are being lost on a daily basis since the conflict erupted. The civilian population, mainly children, women, and the elderly, are suffering the most from the atrocities and grave effects of this war. In supporting this resolution, Mozambique associates ourselves with the collective efforts of this Council aimed at ensuring the protection of civilians and the respect for international human rights law, international humanitarian law, the Geneva Convention, as applied to this conflict both in Gaza and in Israel. It is our strong call that humanitarian aid must reach the needy populations in Gaza. That includes the provision of essential goods and services, as well as medical supplies. Mr. President, we are conscious of the fact that ultimately humanitarian problems need political solutions. This belief reflects our own experience, originated from our protracted struggle against colonialism, racism, and apartheid in the Southern African region. In this context, we urge all the parties to immediately stop attacks, refrain from further violence, and engage in constructive dialogue. Mozambique firmly believes that Israel and Palestine can only resolve their differences through dialogue. We hold the view that peace is always possible if the conflicting parties are genuinely willing to follow the path of justice and tolerance. We therefore wish to reiterate our appeal to the members of this Council to redouble our efforts toward a sustainable solution to the Israeli-Palestine conflict. We believe the Palestinian people and the Israeli people have their inalienable right to statehood. They can live together, side by side, in peace and security as good neighbors. As a matter of fact, the Charter compels the parties, and indeed the entire international community, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me begin by thanking your presidency and all delegations for the efforts made to have a consensual resolution that could have helped support the efforts of this Council to de-escalate the rising tensions and respond to the tragic situation that we are all witnessing in the Gaza Strip and in southern Israel. We deeply regret that the resolution could not pass. For Ghana, we have always held that the Council should, as far as possible, speak in one voice on this important dispute, whose fault lines reach many distant parts of the world. We have therefore, from the very beginning, given priority to the efforts entrusted to the Presidency to lead all of us in that direction. It was in this regard also that we voted in favor of the Brazilian draft resolution, but deemed it important to abstain from the draft resolution proposed on Monday night and the amendments to today's resolution to preserve the broadest possible agreement that was found to guide us in a common direction. Despite the high sensitivities of the decades-old Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the differences in approaches we may have in resolving it, what should be paramount is our historic responsibility as a Council to deliver the two-state solution and preserve the lives of the two nations whose destinies are bound by history and a common and shared area. The Council's inability to act on its responsibility today, however, should not break our resolve. We believe that a united Council voice and action on the matter is still required and critical in stabilizing the situation and assisting the parties to enter into dialogue, which is the only viable path to durable peace. We should therefore continue to ask the parties to de-escalate, seek consensus to support mediation efforts, and knock on the doors of all those that can have a moderating influence on the parties to open up the space for dialogue. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Japan voted in favor of the resolution because it can support its main ideas, bearing in mind various perspectives, including the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Japan has unequivocally condemned the terror attacks by Hamas and others, and called for the immediate release of those who were kidnapped. We feel strong indignation at the tremendous damage and harm to innocent civilians brought by the attack on a hospital in Gaza City on the 17th. At the same time, we would like to point out that Japan had asked to delay the vote on this resolution proposed by Brazil, understanding that various countries, including the United States, have been continuing to make diplomatic efforts on the ground to improve the situation as soon as possible. Japan expresses its great regret at the fact that the resolution was voted to a vote today nevertheless. Japan has consistently and strongly supported and put the faith in diplomatic efforts by US President Biden and other relevant countries. All of us, including those who refer to hypocrisy in particular, should think twice if we are really faithful to human rights principles and if we are doing sufficient efforts to make difference on the ground in improving humanitarian situation. Actions are needed. Japan will continue to work together with other countries to ensure the safety of civilians and realize an early de-escalation of the situation. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Japan, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. On the 7th of October already, Switzerland firmly condemned the terrorist acts, the indiscriminate attacks and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas against the Israeli people. We deplore the deaths of thousands of civilians, including hundreds of children in Israel, and the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly Gaza. Switzerland echoes the Secretary-General in condemning unequivocally the strikes, particularly those which, according to United Nations figures, have led to hundreds of deaths and dozens of injured yesterday in the Al-Ahli Hospital, Anglican Episcopal Church. And we express our sincere condolences to the injured and the victims. We are concerned regarding the large-scale humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the dramatic situation faced by civilians. 1 million people have been displaced, and it is urgent for humanitarian aid to be able to enter. Water, electricity and medical supplies are are dwindling. We have all spoken around this table yesterday about the situation in the Middle East, which requires united, urgent action by the Council. De-escalation, protection of civilians, humane treatment for all hostages, and Switzerland calls for immediate release, as well as rapid, safe, unhindered humanitarian access are all priorities. The draft resolution tabled by Brazil met these priorities with aiming for a common understanding by this Council, which is why we voted in favour of it and very much regret the failure to adopt the resolution put to the vote today. I wish to thank your delegation once again, President, for your sustained commitment. It is regrettable that we have not yet been able to reach consensus on a product showing our unity in the face of this situation. Independently of the adoption of a resolution, all the parties must uphold international humanitarian law, particularly the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution, as well as human rights. International humanitarian law takes account of legitimate security and military needs. All of these rules must therefore be respected with no exception. President, Switzerland has deployed every effort to contribute to reaching consensus on a Council product in this urgent situation. Along these same lines, we remain at your disposal to support any new initiatives which could result in action by this Council. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. This morning, this Council is seeing its credibility put to the test, given the scope of the deadly violence in Israel and Gaza and the extreme gravity of the crisis in the Middle East, whose shockwave is threatening peace and security in the whole of the region and beyond. As a Security Council, our mandate is to halt wars, or failing that, to prevent them and to alleviate the human suffering born of crises. This morning, the Security Council was not equal to this mandate. The rhetoric around this table provided no succor, no help to civilians in Gaza, who are falling in the face of indiscriminate strikes by missiles and rockets, and who are deprived of all means of survival. Once again, politics and geopolitics have paralysed this Council's capacity for action. This Council is not reacting in the face of horror and the screams of distress of civilians, in the face of one of the most serious crises in the Middle East, and we are counting the deaths and the destruction whilst remaining powerless. This Council has not provided any coherent response to provide a glimmer of hope to the children, the women, the hostages, and the peoples of the world who were watching our deliberations for their survival and for saving them. My country voted in favour of the draft resolution tabled by the Brazilian presidency and the two amendments proposed, because it is crucial and urgent to act, having issued strong condemnations of the barbaric attacks against Israel on the 7th of October last and recognised Israel's right to legitimate defence, whilst upholding the principles of proportionality and distinction with regard to combatants and civilians. We firmly believe that given the magnitude of the deadly violence, which over a few days has caused thousands of deaths and immeasurable humanitarian distress, we must call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the opening of humanitarian corridors to alleviate the suffering of civilians. Our position has been clear since the first Council meeting. Hostage-taking is unacceptable and unjustifiable and indefensible, and we reiterate the hostages must be released with no conditions, no blackmail. We regret the fact that the Council was unable to overcome its divisions. We must certainly show greater responsibility so as to find a solution to the crisis in the Middle East, whose chronic nature questions our credibility and tarnishes our reputation. For Gabon, the two-state solution is the only credible alternative. We can and must achieve this through diplomacy, good faith negotiation, and overcoming fears and self-interest. Responsibility of maintaining peace and security in the region and beyond. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And let me start by thanking you for your good faith efforts to negotiate this resolution. The draft resolution on which we have just voted rightly condemns the appalling Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel on the 7th of October. It also makes clear that all actions need to be taken in line with international humanitarian law. It stresses the importance of ensuring humanitarian access and protecting civilians, and emphasises this Council's shared priority of preventing regional escalation of the conflict. We welcome and support the draft resolution's attempts to set out the Council's view on these critical points. But the draft resolution needed to be clearer on Israel's inherent right to self-defense in line with the UN Charter after Hamas attacks killed over 1,400 people and took almost 200 people hostage. The draft resolution also ignored the fact that Hamas are using innocent Palestinian civilians as human shields. They have embedded themselves in civilian communities and made the Palestinian people their victims too. For these reasons, the United Kingdom abstained on this resolution. My Prime Minister has been clear that the UK stands with Israel in the face of these atrocities. We support Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas, take back the hostages, deter further incursions, and strengthen its security for the long term. In so doing, we will continue to call on Israel to take all feasible precautions to avoid harming Palestinian civilians and to act in line with international humanitarian law. We will continue to work closely with Israel and our partners in the region to respond to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, to ensure that civilians are protected and have access to food, water, medicine, and shelter, and to work towards the peace and stability promised by the two-state solution. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
President, we voted in favour of the draft tabled by the Brazilian presidency, as did many other members of this Council. It was the result of a constructive collective negotiating process by all members of the Council, and we are convinced that the collective work and negotiation in good faith are indispensable for effective multilateralism. And these are the best way to fulfill the responsibilities placed upon us. We fully believe, President, that the Council cannot continue in silence in the face of events which are clearly a threat to international peace and security, and which are already having serious humanitarian consequences. The Brazilian presidency's draft includes elements which are necessary in the face of a situation which is worsening by the minute. The credibility of the Council depends upon our decisions at times like this. In this regard, Ecuador abstained with regard to the amendments, since these are elements which are covered in the resolution. We regret the fact that once again the Council was unable to adopt a resolution through the use of the veto. But this is not the end of our efforts. We will do everything within our reach to ensure that the Council can very soon pronounce itself and act with regard to this conflict. President, on the 24th of September 1973, the Ecuadorian Chancellor Antonio Lucio Paredes spoke before the General Assembly and said, and I quote, that it is necessary for the actions of the great powers which in one way or another support the parties to the conflict in the Middle East be guided towards seeking solutions to establish constructive peace and do not hamper possible agreements and understandings. The Middle East conflict, because of its explosive nature, compels the United Nations to tirelessly attempt to bring an end to it. Close quote. These words remain valid, even though they were said over 50 years ago. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Brazil for their efforts, the diligence in providing time, and the continued engagement with all the Security Council members. The text came at a very critical moment, not only for the conflict between Israel and Hamas and the huge impact it's having on civilians, but also for the revived dangers for the region and beyond. Albania voted in favor because the text responded to core objectives on the issue and to our coherent and principled position. It strongly and unequivocally condemned Hamas and its indefensible terrorist attacks on Israel on 7 October 2023. It called for the immediate release of the hostages, which should remain a humanitarian priority, as the Secretary General called upon Hamas last Sunday. They should be released immediately and unconditionally. It provided for the protection of civilians in accordance with international humanitarian law and the flow of the humanitarian aid to all those in need. It also supports the regional and international efforts for a solution on the ground and embraces a diplomatic solution to the crisis. In this respect, we commend the very active engagement at every level by the United States and others to finding the best solutions on the ground. While we supported the draft, Albania reaffirms its position in full support of Israel and its right to self-defense, like every other nation under attack, which the resolution falls short to mention. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, it is perhaps beyond me to put into words the abject horrors we are witnessing in Gaza. That is why the United Arab Emirates fully supported the Council to take action today, and we still support that the Council does take action on this situation. For more than 140 years, the Al Ahli Baptist Hospital has provided medical care and shelter for generations of Gazans. Yesterday, more than 500 Palestinians were killed in a strike that hit the hospital. Each passing hour of this ruinous war makes a mockery of these principles of international humanitarian law. Gaza is laid to waste, and nobody feels safe. We call for a full, independent investigation into this incident, and for those who are responsible to be held accountable. As we verify information about the strike, one fact still remains indisputable. More Palestinians have died in this outbreak of violence than in any other in the history of the conflict. In less than 2 weeks of bombardment, more than 3,500 Palestinians have been killed and more than 14,000 injured. Will we continue to sit here and compare the casualties on both sides? We support no less than a full humanitarian ceasefire. We don't ask for this to be done at the expense of Israel's security, but so that people may tend to their wounded, bury their dead in dignity, and begin putting their lives back together. This ceasefire is also crucial so that vital humanitarian aid may enter and aid workers do their work safely. Mr. President, Hamas is indeed responsible for sparking this latest fire that is now engulfing the streets of Arab capitals around the region. We have called them out on this openly for the heinous attacks on the 7th of October. But make no mistake, the kindling was already there, fueled by decades of violent dehumanization, dispossession, and despair. That is why we cannot, however convenient, lose sight of the context of this crisis, the longest-going occupation in the world today of a people that do not wish to be ruled and have been let down again and again and again by all of us. Mr. President, the UAE voted for this resolution not because it is a perfect text, but because it clearly states basic principles which must be upheld and which this Council is obliged to reinforce and uphold. We really thank Brazil and its delegation for their efforts, and we remain hopeful that in the coming days we can unite behind a resolution, and that also in parallel diplomatic efforts led by the United States help lead us all off this brink that we are edging towards. As I and others said yesterday, the current escalation must drive all of us, but most importantly, Israelis and Palestinians, to the urgent work of achieving the two-state solution. Let me be clear, the only alternative to that is the violence we see right now. 3 years ago, my country established diplomatic relations with Israel. The Abraham Accords are grounded in a simple but enduring truth that peace and dialogue are better than violence and enmity. Along with our Israeli and American partners, we sought a new Middle East where coexistence and cooperation deliver prosperity, security, and peace for all. The indiscriminate damage visited upon the people of Gaza in pursuit of Israel's security risks extinguishing that hope. The region is already contending with the spillover of this crisis, and the enemies of peace are unapologetic about their aims. Let us not play into their hands. Mr. President, it has been said over the past few days that this crisis is a test for the international community and for the UN Security Council. That is true. Noa Argamani, a young Jewish woman abducted by Hamas, is in her second year of computer studies at Ben Gurion University. Her mother is undergoing cancer treatment, and she is their only child. In a conversation with a journalist about the horror inflicted on this family, Yaakov recalled that in Gaza, too, families are mourning their children. He described Israelis and Palestinians as two nations with one father, and added that we can reach true peace, and I'm praying for this to happen. Amen to the hostages' return. 22-year-old Dunya Abu Rahma, an architectural student in Gaza, is one of the thousands of civilians today fleeing south. Last night, she told CNN that up until recently, all she had been thinking about was her graduation project. Now all she thinks about is how to be safe. The test, colleagues, is whether or not we sustain that hope for peace that shines even through a parent's unspeakable anguish and a child's aspiration to just be normal like the rest of us. We cannot doom millions of people to misery because diplomacy is hard. We must keep trying again and again and again. We must recognize that by continuing to fail to respond to the Palestinian people's legitimate aspirations for a country in their homeland, we fuel this unrelenting cycle of violence and hatred. Let us not fail this test for the sake of Israelis, for the sake of all peoples of the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned. The 9,443rd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Algeria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Libya, Oman, Pakistan, South Africa, Syria, and Tunisia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Martin Griffiths, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Mr. Thor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of the item 2 of the agenda, and I'll give the floor to Mr. Thor Wennesland.
Mr. President, members of the Council, the Secretary General and I have briefed this Council extensively in private over the last days on details of the horrific and unprecedented events that have been unfolding, relaying our utter condemnation, shock and regret. I will not repeat my briefings here today, noting that I will report on the situation next week during my regular monthly briefing. My colleague Martin will brief you on the humanitarian situation. Today, I want to update you on where we are on my efforts over the last days to find a way to bring the end to hostilities and spare lives of civilians. I have to be very honest here and now and say that this is one of the most difficult moments facing the Israeli and Palestinian people in the last 75 years. The massacre and despicable acts of violence and terror perpetrated by Hamas against Israelis on 7 October are seared into our collective memories. Whole families killed, women and children abducted to the Strip and held up until this day. There is no justification or excuse of such an act of terror, and I condemn them unequivocally. We are facing a devastating and clearly difficult challenge for the region and for the international community. It comes at a moment when the global institutions will need to respond to such act and crisis. They are already overstretched. We are in a war, and wars are filled with horrific scenes of violence and tragedy. Last night I watched in horror and in real time, as I was sure we all did, as reports of mass casualties emerged from what should be a protected site, shielded from danger, a place of healing. Hundreds of Palestinians were killed, patients, and those seeking shelter when Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza City was struck by lethal fire. The circumstances of this catastrophe and responsibility still needs to be clarified, and we will need a fact-based fully investigation and broad investigation. But the result of all this is very clear, Mr. President. It is a terrible tragedy for those who were involved. I fear that we are at the brink of a deep and dangerous abyss that could change the trajectory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if not of the Middle East as a whole. After more than a century of conflict and over half a century of occupation, we, the international community, have failed collectively to bring the parties to a just, sustained political resolution. The long-standing issues run deep and extend well beyond the confines of Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory. The events of the past 11 days have served to reignite grievances and reanimate alliances across the region. Based on my meetings and the dynamics I observe on the ground, I would say the following. The risk of an expansion of this conflict is real, very, very real, and extremely dangerous. Mr. President, since the outbreak of the current hostilities, it has been my absolute priority to work to diminish these existential threats. With the Secretary General, I have been in constant communication with a broader range of interlocutors, with the parties, with regional and international actors who have agencies and influence. I will continue to do so. Today, I speak to you from Doha, where the authorities have assured me of their continued commitment to the Palestinian people and their humanitarian needs, and the urgency to prevent any further loss of civilian lives. Meetings and ongoing discussions with leaders in Egypt have focused not only on the question of facilitating access to Rafah crossing on humanitarian assistance, but also our shared concern and efforts to rein in further regional hostilities. I will return to Cairo tomorrow to join the Secretary General to continue these political discussions. In this regard, we welcome President al-Sisi's swift call for a summit of world leaders to continue these discussions. I also had similar discussions with leaders in Lebanon and Jordan, as well as on repeated phone calls with the P5 and other key regional and international partners who are seized of an activity engaged and addressing this conflict. We are all seeking a common understanding and approach at this critical time. I welcome the visits of world leaders such as German Chancellor Scholz, the UK Foreign Minister Cleverly, and today, the visit by President Biden. With the parties on the ground in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Ramallah, my message have remained steadfast that we must not let the dynamic of the current conflict take our eyes off what I will call the day after. The day after we need to start working on now, immediately. We know the way forward. These days, I can tell you, diplomacy is very hard. But here is what we need to do. We need the time and space to achieve two urgent objectives. Hamas' immediate, unconditional release of all hostages. Secondly, and fast, unrestricted access of humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza. The third thing must be a collective effort to end the hostilities and prevent any further expansion of the conflict to the region. Regarding West Bank and Lebanon, there should be no miscalculation, no provocation, and no step that closes the door for our current efforts. The step beyond must be down the path towards the political solution. Ultimately, the only way to bring the end to the bloodletting and prevent any recurrence of the to pave a way forward, a long-term political solution is needed in line with UN resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. As I've stated many times to this Council, a patchwork of ad hoc and temporary fixes and perpetual management of conflict without addressing underlying issues is not sustainable. That has been proven over the last 11 days. What we are seeing on the ground now, all too tragically, proves that this is true. What we must do now is to work together as one to achieve these objectives. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Winnesland for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Martin Griffiths. Martin, you have the floor. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, sorry, my technical knowledge, Sergio, is not brilliant. Thank you very much for inviting me. And what I was saying was what an honor it is for me to be on the same podium as Tor. And I associate myself profoundly with every single word that he said, which is born out of years of relevant experience, including not just looking at the horrors of the last 11 days, but anxiously looking ahead at the horrors to come. So all credit to Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland. But I also, of course, join him and all members of the Council in expressing my horror and despair at the explosion that he described, watching, as so many of us did, at the Al-Ahli Anglican Episcopal Hospital in the northern Gaza Strip yesterday evening. My heartfelt condolences, of course, go out to the grieving families affected by this heart-wrenching tragedy. And I also extend my sincerest wishes for a swift and complete recovery to all those who've been injured. According to the World Health Organization, the hospital in question was one of 20 in northern Gaza, subject to the announcement by the Israeli authorities that civilians should leave for their safety. It's a terrible thought to think of that the morning after. However, evacuation for many had simply not been possible due to insecurity, as we have been discussing in this chamber this afternoon, the critical condition of many of the patients, and indeed the lack of ambulances, staff, and capacity in the rest of the health system, which, as you know, Mr. President, is on its knees in Gaza. When that hospital was hit, it was fully operational, and indeed it had breached its maximum capacity. It was therefore overflowing with patients, including women and children. Dozens of healthcare providers and caregivers demonstrating their extraordinary, frankly, extraordinary courage and commitment to remain sur place, remain there to do their duties and to remain steadfast by their patients' sides. And they were also in the building. And the hospital was also hosting numerous internally displaced people who either had nowhere else to go or were sheltering there in the expectation, or at least perhaps the hope, that it would provide safety. And they were wrong. So far, reports indicate hundreds of fatalities, hundreds of civilians and healthcare workers, and I associate myself with Tor's call for a fact-based inquiry to find out how this happened. Here I want to say one thing of the highest importance to all of us in the humanitarian community and those of us, all of us indeed, who are governed by the rules of war and international humanitarian law. What happened on the 7th of October in the invasion into Israel and the taking of those hostages still taken and hidden away in Gaza was simply wrong, against the law, unconscionable, unacceptable. Their unconditional release is an essential component of any return to the kind of normalcy that Lana was describing to us earlier before this session started. Since the 7th of October, 28 health workers in Gaza have reportedly been killed. 23 have been injured. There's no lack of courage. There's no lack of commitment in that population. There have been many reports of health facilities sustaining extensive damage. Indeed, the hospital itself had already been struck, as you know, on the 14th of October. Gaza's health services, as I've been hearing here in Cairo these last day or two, are being overwhelmed by the extreme challenge of meeting the healthcare needs of the rising number of wounded patients, all the while facing significant shortages of medical supplies, water, and fuel. And the destruction of that hospital yesterday heaped further pressure on this crumbling, this failing, this sad healthcare system. Not only were the victims rushed to Shifa Hospital, one of the many other hospitals in Gaza on the verge of collapse, but it also now deprives Gaza of a facility that cared for more than 45,000 patients a year before the current hostilities. So I am compelled to reiterate, and this will not surprise anybody, as everyone else has done on many occasions in this council, that under international humanitarian law, there are simple requirements. There are simple rules of war which are applied to all of us, whatever the provocation, and God knows there has been provocation. Parties to armed conflict must protect civilians and civilian objects, take constant care to spare them from any attack. We have discussed this in almost every other conflict in this chamber around the world. This one is no different. International law affords specific protection to medical personnel and facilities to ensure the wounded and sick receive the medical care they need. It was no coincidence that one of the first humanitarian leaders on the scene after those events of the 7th of October was our dear friend and leader, Dr. Tedros of WHO. It's imperative that the wounded and the sick receive the medical care they need. It is imperative that the parties respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, and it is our collective responsibility. We are all involved in this. We are not observers. We are all involved in using all our influence to ensure that this is the case. This tragedy is characteristic of the crushing impact this conflict has had on civilians, and as Tor has been pointing out, and Lana earlier, the catastrophic consequences it will have if it continues to escalate as we fear. In just 11 days since that storming of Israel by Palestinian armed groups on 7th of October, The death toll, as has been mentioned, has already exceeded that of the 2014 hostilities, which lasted more than 7 weeks. The pace of death, of suffering, of destruction, of breaches of international law cannot be exaggerated. In Gaza, more than 3,000 people have been killed, more than 12,500 injured. Hundreds are unaccounted for under the rubble, and quite frankly, we do not know how many have moved from the north to the south to get out of harm's way. The death toll also, we all know this well, includes humanitarians. I want to pay tribute to the 15 UNRWA staff and Red Cross and Red Crescent personnel that I've been meeting these days, the families of those who have fallen. We estimate that maybe up to 1 million people have fled their homes to other parts of Gaza, but we don't really know. Many have done so in response indeed to Israel's announcement that civilians should leave northern Gaza for safety. But there is simply nowhere to go for civilians to escape the destruction and privation, both of which grow by the hour as missiles continue to fly, and essential supplies, including fuel, food, medical items, water, run low. Due to the scarcity of water, UNRWA in some locations, and I want to pay a special tribute to UNRWA for the way in which it's provided a buffer against suffering in these terrible times. And in UNRWA in some locations is being forced to ration down to providing 1 liter of water per person per day. Bear in mind that the minimum by international standards should be 15 liters, and they're getting 1, and they're the lucky ones. People have been increasingly forced to consume from unsafe sources. We're hearing many, many more reports of that through UNRWA and other agencies, placing the population at risk, of course, of the outbreak of waterborne diseases. And whether civilians move or stay, and that must be their decision, whether to move or stay, whether to move again or stay where they have moved to. Whether they move or stay, they must be protected. They must not be attacked in places of civilian infrastructures. They must be protected in places of deconfliction. And they must have access to the essentials of humanitarian assistance to survive, which are available and in which we have all spent many, many detailed hours in detailed negotiations with the parties. And I'm grateful to them, to all of them, for the commitment that they have shown to these negotiations. It means that the UN and the humanitarian partners, and I specifically refer to the great leadership shown, and I met their leaders today, of the Egyptian Red Crescent and the Palestinian Red Crescent, must be able to deliver relief to civilians in need throughout Gaza without impediment in places of their choice, in places where they consider themselves to be safe and where we can seek to ensure that safety. We have humanitarian supplies. We have medical teams. UNRWA has a staff of 14,000 in Gaza still, bravely working under these conditions. The other agencies do. The Red Crescents, of course, have many, many, many volunteers, and they are all ready to assist the people most in need. I'm very grateful to many member states for providing very quickly emergency funding available for the immediate relief in Gaza, including from the Central Emergency Response Fund that my office runs, and the Occupied Territories Humanitarian Fund. Thank you. Thank you to all of you who stepped up so quickly. What we don't have, however, we have a lot, but what we don't have, and it's the killer, and what we desperately need, is immediate safe humanitarian access across all of Gaza. And that is the burden of our discussions with key parties. We urgently need a mechanism agreed by all relevant parties to allow for the regular provision of emergency needs throughout Gaza, to get the level of distribution of assistance up to what it was before these terrible weeks of 100 trucks a day providing assistance throughout Gaza to people in need. We need to get back to that level of ambition. For that, we need additional funding for agencies like UNRWA, World Food Programme, and of course for the Red Crescents in their leadership role. And without new funding, UNRWA, already painfully, woefully lacking in funds, will not have the ability to continue to deliver core services. But as Mr. President, as Tor said, and I'm glad he did, and he made two, I think, very important points. Gaza is not the only location of concern in this deeply troubling conflict. Since the start of the latest hostilities, the situation in the West Bank has also been deteriorating, as Tor said, and he should know. Last week was the deadliest week for Palestinians in the West Bank since the United Nations started recording fatalities in 2005, while settler violence incidents also have gone up from an average of 3 incidents a day to 8. Suffering knows no borders. Widespread closures throughout the West Bank are impacting the ability of communities to access essential services, and there is a real risk of the situation spiraling out of control. What the people of Israel, Palestine, the region need, what we all need, what this Council's mandate is in existence to secure, is the sanity and humanitarian to prevail, drawing on the provisions of international humanitarian law for urgent efforts, this was Tor's second point, to arrest any further descent in this brutal calamity. Lana said it very eloquently, the worry that I suppose many of us have, where will this lead us? Where will this lead us when the fighting has taken place? Of course, we implore the parties to respect international humanitarian law. And by the way, I want to be very clear, a humanitarian ceasefire would go a long way to easing the epic human suffering. Finally, Mr. President, I know I've gone on too long. I want to conclude by expressing my deepest admiration, gratitude, and comity for the extraordinary people who are delivering life-saving and humanitarian services in Gaza, in the West Bank, as they do in so many other parts of the world. Many of whom are displaced, many have lost loved ones, many of our staff in all our agencies have had that kind of suffering. The dedication and bravery of ambulance crews, healthcare professionals, people working in hospitals and clinics, actually is a reminder of the fundamentals of humanity which drive our efforts to resolve these differences, to resolve them through diplomacy, through dialogue, through kindness, through generosity, and through accountability. I also want to express my profound personal gratitude. I have said it also already for Tor, but also to my colleague and his colleague, our Deputy Special Coordinator, Resident and Humanitarian Coordinator, somebody with a title as long as mine, Lynn Hastings, and the humanitarians who are demonstrating unwavering commitment providing essential assistance and relief. Their collective efforts, their unstinting focus on key priorities which are based on operational needs, exemplifies not just the United Nations' enduring commitment to extending hope and support, but exemplifies the commitment of the humanitarian community and its supporters, all of whom are in this room, to do the job that they have decided and resolved to choose for their lives. Sergio, Mr. President, thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Griffiths for his briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Security Council. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, colleagues, along with the delegations of the UAE and China, we initiated today's Emergency Security Council meeting given the tragic events in the Gaza Strip. Yesterday, as a result of airstrikes, the Ali Akha hospital was destroyed in the area of Gaza City. We are deeply shocked by what occurred. The Anglican Church Hospital was one of the 20 in northern Gaza that received evacuation notices from the Israeli military. However, it was impossible to meet that requirement, and Martin Griffiths already said that, given the prevailing unstable situation, the critical condition of many patients, and also the shortage of ambulances, staff, stretchers, and alternative accommodation for the displaced persons. The airstrike on the hospital, according to latest reports, caused over 800 deaths and injuries. We are calling for an objective investigation to be carried out and for the perpetrators to be prosecuted. Mr. President, colleagues, this is the price of the inertia of members of the Council, many of whom have procrastinated over the past 11 days since the start of the escalation surrounding Gaza. We warned you about this on Monday when a number of members of the Council, guided by, in inverted commas, purely humanitarian considerations, but actually by purely political considerations, did not support the Russian draft on the ceasefire. Our document laid out a number of specific urgent measures designed to stop violence and civilian suffering, designed to release the hostages and to prevent the impending humanitarian disaster in that part of Palestine and avoid the conflict spilling over into other countries of the region. Given the extremely tense situation, action should have been taken very promptly. This is precisely why our draft did not contain political elements or views or a mention of any party to the conflict that might have complicated reaching agreement on it. Despite this, in full view of the international community, the UN Security Council, the primary body for the maintenance of international peace and security, was not in a position to adopt a decision that could have prevented the humanitarian tragedy in Gaza. The Council did not send a clear, robust collective signal with a call for a swift, lasting, reasonable humanitarian ceasefire. Today, we have seen the terrible fruit of this. Once again, it's become clear that the position of Washington and some other Western capitals did not allow for a natural, logical decision to be taken. This, given the circumstances, is an absolute key humanitarian imperative, and it is the moral duty of all responsible members of the international community. Furthermore, humanitarian considerations, the norms of international law, and the root causes of why the Palestinian question has not been settled, all things we've repeatedly and insistently stressed over recent years, of course, don't count for them. Mr. President, The number of injured and dead in Israel dead and injured rather, was 1,400 and 3,900 respectively. And the number of victims in Palestine was more than 2,800 and 10,800 respectively. And today, these figures are even higher. As per UN reports, 450 children have died in Gaza, and some 750 are still under the rubble of the buildings destroyed during the airstrikes. More than 2 million inhabitants of Gaza still have no water, food, medical assistance, fuel, or electricity. The only border crossing on the border with Egypt, the Rafah crossing, once again is coming under missile fire and has not been opened up for civilian evacuations or the provision of humanitarian goods. De facto, the military blockade of Gaza has held hostage 1,000 Russian citizens and members of their families. Given this very worrying situation, the UN agencies, the WHO, UNICEF, the UNFPA, with one voice condemned the strike on the Al-Ahli hospital and called for a prompt active protection of civilians and medical infrastructure. Yesterday at the briefing on the situation in Gaza, the deputy head of OCHA, Joyce Misuya, noted that the number of victims of the current escalation in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that has gone on for 11 days has already exceeded the number of victims that were killed during the hostilities in 2014. The path to that ceasefire took some 7 weeks. This cannot fail to horrify us. Humanitarian workers are dying. The number of people forced to leave their homes in Gaza is about 1 million people. The humanitarian blockade of the Palestinian enclave is pushing the entire population to the brink. The population that de facto, right before our eyes, are being sacrificed. Mr. President, we would urge the Israeli side to prioritise international humanitarian law, at the centre of which is the lives of Palestinian citizens and critical emergency care and medical facilities. Humanitarian access should be provided without delay. We call for an immediate ceasefire and an opening of corridors to supply emergency humanitarian assistance to the affected areas of the Palestinian enclave and to evacuate civilians. An immediate cessation of violence against civilians as well, irrespective of where they live. In a number of Arab and European countries, there have been outbreaks of large-scale unrest, given the ongoing Israeli missile strikes. In this regard, we condemn the attacks on diplomatic missions in foreign countries, of foreign states. Mr. President, all that we're talking about just now is happening with the inaction of the Security Council, which is paralysed by the self-serving interests of some countries and with unilateral actions which not only have ended in complete failure but also have led to a widespread escalation of violence in the Middle East region. Mr. President, we are extremely concerned by the unprecedented scale of the humanitarian disaster in the Gaza Strip and the high risk of the conflict spillover. Assuming the UN Security Council is not able to come up with an appropriate response to these challenges, we will initiate the resumed 10th emergency special session of the UNGA on the protection of civilians in Palestine in order to have a comprehensive discussion of the situation regarding the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and ways to settle it. A letter on this for the President of the GA has already been written and it will be dispatched forthwith. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
I thank Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland and Under-Secretary General Martin Griffiths for their briefings. President, the airstrikes which hit the Anglican hospital in Gaza yesterday, claiming hundreds of lives and numerous injured amongst Palestinian civilians, is the reflection of the extreme brutality and gravity of the war between Israel and Hamas. Gabon firmly condemns these strikes and the responsibility for these must be established. We recall also that health units and their personnel must be protected in all circumstances pursuant to international humanitarian law. Since the barbarous, unjustifiable and unacceptable attacks of Hamas upon Israel on the 7th of October, the indiscriminate deadly violence against civilians has reached unsustainable levels. My country recognises Israel's right to legitimate defence, which must be exercised whilst upholding the principles of proportionality and distinction between combatants and civilians. 11 days since the outbreak of hostilities, scenes of war marked by indiscriminate shelling are suffused with horror, with dramatic consequences on civilians. The dead and injured are now counted in the thousands. Atrocities against women and children and destruction are all immeasurable. In addition to the cynicism of using human shields, in addition to the rejection of hostage-taking of women and children, we at the moment are seeing millions of people under siege in Gaza, without water, food, gas or electricity, with death as their only prospect. It is time to bring an end to this deadly cycle of violence and this unbearable human distress. We call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for the opening of humanitarian corridors to assist civilian populations in need in Gaza. All parties must abide by their obligations pursuant to international humanitarian law and allow for immediate, unhindered humanitarian access to those in need. I take this opportunity to pay tribute to the humanitarian personnel who are carrying out their activities courageously in difficult, hostile conditions at risk of their lives. President, the conflagration of violence between Israel and Hamas is jeopardizing peace, security and stability in the region and beyond the epicenter. The international community must exhibit greater commitment to prevent and avoid other fronts or poles of violence in the region, which would make the situation still more intractable. Exchanges of fire between Israel and Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon are, in this regard, extremely worrisome. This Council must urgently act to prevent the situation from becoming bogged down, above and beyond strategic interests for each member, above and beyond the depth of emotions. We must, without delay, achieve de-escalation and halt the fighting. We must silence the guns. Diplomacy, dialogue and negotiation, which are at the heart of the United Nations, are the inescapable channels to achieve a solution which guarantees the rights and interests of the parties. And for Gabon, the two-state solution still has no credible alternative. Thank you.
Of Gabon for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I wish to thank USG Griffith and Special Coordinator Westland for their briefings. I wish to particularly commend Special Coordinator Westland for his tireless efforts in actively engaging with all parties for the de-escalation of the conflict to prevent a humanitarian crisis. Together with UAE and the Russian Federation, China also requested this emergency meeting. The Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza was attacked, which claimed the lives of hundreds of innocent civilians. China is shocked by this heinous attack and strongly condemns it. The protection of civilians in armed conflict is a red line under international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian facilities such as hospitals and schools should not and must not be targeted in military operations. The indiscriminate use of force is not acceptable, and the safety of humanitarian medical workers must be guaranteed. We urge Israel to effectively fulfill its international humanitarian law obligations. Look around in Gaza right now. Tragedies like the one at Al Ahli Hospital are unfolding all the time. As a result of the total blockade imposed by Israel, the supply of water, electricity, and fuel in the Gaza Strip has been cut off. The basic supplies, such as food and medicine, are dwindling and urgently needed. Tens of thousands of Gazans have been forced to move south because of the emergency evacuation order issued by Israel, but have suffered from airstrikes in the south as well. From the north to the south, Gaza is full of frightened children and desperate mothers. Under the current circumstances, there's no time to lose in protecting the safety of civilians, carrying out humanitarian relief, and preventing a humanitarian crisis. We call on Israel to lift the full blockade of Gaza, rescind the emergency evacuation order, and stop the airstrikes around the Rafah crossing. We welcome the international community's efforts to open a humanitarian corridor and look forward to substantive progress in the relevant communications and arrangements as soon as possible. We appreciate the important role played by Egypt and other regional countries. Mr. President, development over the past few days have amply demonstrated that an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire must be the overriding priority. As long as the war continues, more violations of international humanitarian law are inevitable. Without a comprehensive ceasefire, any amount of humanitarian assistance will be a drop in the bucket. If the current fighting in Gaza is allowed to drag on, the end result will not be a complete victory, military victory for any side, but rather most likely will be a catastrophe that will engulf the entire region, that will probably completely end the prospect for a two-side solution, plunging the Palestinian and Israeli peoples into a vicious cycle of hatred and confrontation. Arab countries have issued a strong call for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire. The international community should heed this just call of Arab countries and the Palestinian people. We should unite all current diplomatic efforts towards this goal. China welcomes any initiative that is conducive to easing the humanitarian crisis and reducing the suffering of civilians, and supports all efforts aimed at de-escalating the conflict and restoring peace. We hope that all parties concerned will maintain impartiality, actively leveraging their influence on the parties concerned to promote calm, restraint, and work for the cessation of hostilities as soon as possible. Under the current circumstances, all diplomatic efforts should work to send a unified signal. First, there are no winners in wars. Violence for violence can only lead to more serious crises. There must be an immediate ceasefire, abundant military means, and return to the track of dialogue and negotiation. Second, any violence and attacks against civilians should be rejected. Both the Palestinians and the Israelis have the right to be free from fear, and their security should be equally protected. Third, international humanitarian law must be followed. The basic needs of the people of Gaza must be ensured. The humanitarian corridor must be opened immediately, and the hostages must be released. Fourth, the fundamental solution to the Palestinian-Israeli question lies in the implementation of the two-state solution based on relevant UN resolutions and other international consensus to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting settlement so that Palestine and Israel can live side by side in peace. Mr. President, the Security Council bears the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. In the face of the continuing spread of conflicts and the increasingly imminent humanitarian disaster, the Security Council has no reason to remain silent and no excuse to delay further. China does not agree with the claim that the Security Council actions will interfere with ongoing diplomatic efforts. Though the draft resolutions proposed by both Russia and Brazil have not been adopted, the Security Council cannot stop at this. China expects all members of the Security Council to face up to their responsibilities under the Charter, respond to the expectations of the Palestinians and the Israeli peoples and of the international community, move forward in unity and build consensus and make binding decisions on the current crisis situation, decisions that will stand the test of history and conscience. China has been making efforts all along. We will continue to work with the international community to play a constructive role for the ceasefire and the cessation of hostilities, the protection of civilians, and the prevention of further humanitarian crisis in order to realize a comprehensive, just, and lasting solution to the question of Palestine. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. And we have listened carefully to the sobering briefing by Special Coordinator Tor Wennesland and USG Matthew Griffiths. We remain deeply concerned by the unfolding developments in the Gaza Strip and Israel. At the outset, whilst reiterating our strong condemnation of the present hostilities initiated by the Hamas militia on the 7th of October 2023, we are profoundly distressed by the attack on the Al-Ali hospital in Gaza that was also sheltering civilians at the time it was hit. We condemn the attack, which adds to the growing frustration and human tragedy of this conflict, and we call for a full and transparent investigation of the incident and the establishment of accountability. Since 7th October, the world has witnessed unimaginable horror in southern Israel and in the Gaza Strip. Many lives have been lost and many more will be lost if the fighting does not stop. We deeply regret the high civilian cost arising out of the present hostilities and express our solidarity and sympathies to all the families who have lost loved ones to the violence in both Israel and Palestine. Mr. President, Ghana believes that as a council and at this time, our foremost responsibility alongside that of the wider international community should be saving lives, all lives. In this regard, we call on Hamas to immediately and unconditionally release all hostages and concurrently urge both sides to halt the firing of rockets and missiles. We further urge Israel to restore essential services such as electricity and water supply to Gaza and permit humanitarian access of food and medicines to the vulnerable populations in Gaza. We note the efforts of the United Nations and other humanitarian partners committed to operating in the unfolding difficult circumstances and urge funding for the emerging humanitarian needs and for the flash appeal. In making these calls, however, we do not ignore the dictates of international law and the charter of this organization, including relevant resolutions which affirm the right of guaranteed territorial inviolability for the states in the region, including Israel, as well as their right to self-defense, nor deny the necessity of accountability for those most responsible for the egregious, horrific, and heinous incidents committed since Hamas initiated its attacks against Israel on 7th October. For many member states reborn into modern statehood in the last century, we cannot cease to underscore the importance of respect and adherence to the established principles of international law, international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian objects must be protected at all times, and international law, which has been instrumental in the achievement of our respective statehoods, must be upheld by all, even in conflicts, to protect innocent lives, to safeguard security, and facilitate the aspirations for statehood. The deterioration of the security situation and the upward spiral of the violence poses the risk of a further spread and a danger to international peace and security. We therefore strongly urge a stop to the fighting, accompanied by the exercise of maximum restraint in good faith by all sides, to enable mediation to play its role in releasing the hostages and addressing all immediate concerns, including the growing humanitarian needs of the civilian population in Gaza. We must all make every effort to reverse the downward spiral and provide a horizon of hope for the people of the two nations. I conclude by reiterating Ghana's enduring commitment of support for achieving durable peace between Israel and Palestine. We believe that reinvigorating the Middle East peace process presents the most viable path for the international community to end the cycle of violence. The vision of a region where Israel and Palestine live side by side within secure and recognized borders should not be diminished even in this darkest of hours. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, thank you. Thank you very much for having convened this emergency meeting. I would also like to thank the Under-Secretary General, Mr. Martin Griffiths, and Special Coordinator Tor Venesland for their very sincere descriptions of a very, very bleak situation. I'd like to thank them and in particular their teams for their efforts, their work, their courage in the most difficult of circumstances. I would like to express my condolences to the families of the victims of those humanitarian workers who have died. As early as the 7th of October, Switzerland very strongly condemned the acts of terror, the indiscriminate attacks and hostage-taking perpetrated by Hamas against the Israeli population. We call for all, that is, all hostages held in Gaza to be treated humanely and released immediately, and our thoughts are with them. Switzerland joins the Secretary General also in unequivocally condemning yesterday's strikes, in particular the one that, according to the United Nations, left hundreds dead and dozens injured at the Al-Ahli Anglican Hospital. We extend our deepest condolences to the families of the victims. This incident must be thoroughly investigated so that the facts can be clarified. Mr. President, we can but repeat it over and over again. The civilian population and civilian objects must be respected and protected. International humanitarian law also requires that hospitals, clinics, and the people who are treated there, as well as the medical staff who work there, be protected. The same applies to UNRWA schools, which are civilian facilities of the UN. At the same time, the humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate rapidly. Water and power cuts are causing a serious health crisis. Nearly 1 million Gazans have had to flee their homes to take refuge in the south. The Gaza Strip is under complete siege. UNRWA schools act as vital shelters for the 400,000 displaced persons, many of them children. The capacity of these schools, as well as those of the hospitals, has been exceeded. All parties must allow the safe, rapid and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid. We urge them to immediately observe pauses in hostilities and, as the Secretary General has called for, a humanitarian ceasefire. Mr. President, as we repeated after the vote this morning, all parties must exercise the utmost restraint in the conduct of hostilities. They must respect international humanitarian law, in particular the principles of distinction, proportionality and precaution, and human rights. All possible measures must be taken to avoid the impact of hostilities on the civilian population and civilians. As international humanitarian law takes account of legitimate security and military necessity, all its rules must be respected without exception. We stress the need to investigate all violations of international law so that the perpetrators can be brought to justice. The respect for international humanitarian law can also curb a spiral of violence that could ignite the entire region. Mr. President, Switzerland underlines the importance of the good offices of the United Nations in this crisis. We'd like to thank them. We welcome the Secretary General's visit to Egypt and the region. As Under Secretary General Martin Griffiths and UNRWA Commissioner General, Philip Lazzarini said yesterday in a joint statement, and I quote, "Humanity must prevail in Gaza. Humanity must prevail everywhere. De-escalation must remain the priority. As members of the Security Council, we must redouble our efforts to contribute to this and exert our influence on the parties, individually and collectively, to do the same." Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
President, we are grateful to the briefings of this morning and for convening this emergency meeting in the face of tragic news which exacerbates the escalation of violence which began on the 7th of October. I wish to express our deep sadness and condemnation in the strongest terms of the death of hundreds of civilians in the Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza. Hospitals cannot be the target of attacks in any circumstances or for any pretext. There is no justification at all for what happened yesterday. Likewise, we deplore the deaths of UNRWA personnel, teachers, doctors, engineers, psychologists and support staff. Humanitarian assistance staff must always be protected. President, since this is the first time I will be referring to this publicly, above and beyond the explanations which we provided this morning with regard to the vote, I wish to reiterate our absolute unequivocal condemnation of the unjustifiable terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas. We also express our condolences to the families of the victims of these heinous acts and our solidarity with the people of Israel and other countries whose citizens were affected, including Latin American citizens. We demand that hostages taken by Hamas be released immediately and unconditionally. There is no possible justification of any kind for attacks against innocent civilians, and this is still worse if they are being used as human shields. Hamas's terrorist attacks do not represent the Palestinian people. They do not represent the Palestinian people, nor their inalienable right to self-determination, nor their legitimate aspirations to live in security, liberty, justice, opportunities, and dignity. At this time, painful and unacceptable deaths of innocent civilians are still happening, including women and children in Palestine. We reiterate our solidarity with their families and the peoples. We recognize Israel's right to defend its people, its population, and we recall that by exercising legitimate defense at all times, the principles of international humanitarian law must be upheld, as well as necessity, proportionality, distinction, and humanity. There can be no justification, President, for causing death and pain amongst innocent civilians. So all efforts must be deployed to avoid affecting civilians in this way. We therefore support the call by the Secretary-General to allow for rapid, unimpeded humanitarian access for vital products to Gaza, such as water, food, and fuel. We recognize those who are making efforts to ensure that this is possible. Failing to achieve this would lead to an even greater tragedy. In this regard, we call upon all actors to exhibit restraint to avoid exacerbating tensions and prevent an expansion of violence to other zones. As my delegation has said on numerous occasions, the only way to end this conflict is through a negotiated, definitive and just solution for the parties, with the two-state solution, Palestine and Israel, upon the basis of 1967 borders and the relevant resolutions. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
President, I thank Mr. Griffiths and Mr. Wennesland for their briefings. The situation in Gaza and the region is getting worse since the terrorist attack against Israel by Hamas on the 7th of October. It is regrettable that the Security Council was unable today, 11 days since the attack, to react and to act. It would have been high time for this Council to call for sparing the lives of all civilians. France condemns in the strongest terms the strike against the Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza City, which claimed a large number of Palestinian civilian victims. Nothing can justify a strike upon a hospital, and full light must be shed on this. It would have been high time for this Council to unambiguously condemn Hamas's terrorist attack against Israel. Through the President of the Republic, France did that on the very day, by assuring Israel of our solidarity. It is for these reasons that France voted in favour of the resolution put to the vote today by Brazil. This draft unambiguously condemned acts of violence and terrorism against civilians and called for the urgent opening of humanitarian access to Gaza. Civilians who wish to be able to leave must be able to do so, and Hamas must not prevent them from this. France thanks Brazil for its initiative and its coordinating role. President, Israelis and Palestinians deserve to live in peace and security. I wish to recall France's unwavering solidarity with Israel in these testing times and our deepest condolences to all those families who have lost loved ones, including a significant number of French nationals. France reiterates its unswerving attachment to Israel's security and recalls Israel's right to defend itself whilst fully upholding international humanitarian law and preserving civilian populations in the face of the cowardly terrorist attacks targeting them. France also recalls that international humanitarian law is an obligation for everyone. The protection of civilian populations must be ensured. Humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip must be open without delay, and this means that the security of civilians must be fully guaranteed by humanitarian pauses. With this resolution, the Security Council could have recalled the urgent obligation to allow for the provision of vital supplies to the population of Gaza: water, food, electricity, fuel, medicines. The Council could have called for safe, unhindered access for United Nations and ICRC humanitarian workers to Gaza. With our partners, France is taking every measure to support the United Nations humanitarian operations in Gaza. We call upon members of this Council to do the same. In the face of the humanitarian emergency, France has mobilized 10 million euros of supplementary humanitarian aid for the population of Gaza, which will in particular finance actions by United Nations agencies such as UNRWA and the World Food Programme, as well as humanitarian NGOs. President, only a resumption of dialogue will allow for an end to the relentless violence. The emergency is a humanitarian one, but it is also a diplomatic one. We must do our utmost to avoid a regional conflagration. Those protagonists who could benefit from the situation must abstain from joining the conflict. President, the events of recent days confirm the fact, although it was hardly necessary to do so, that a political resolution to the Israeli conflict is urgent. The conditions for lasting peace are well known. They are indispensable guarantees for the security of Israel and a state for the Palestinians. The legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people and the security of Israel are an indissociable whole. This is a line which France has always defended and will continue to follow. We must collectively mobilize in order to achieve this. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Coordinator To Wensland and USG Griffiths for their updates. The past 2 weeks have been painful, tumultuous, and devastating. The situation in the Middle East is at a dangerous point where the risk of escalation is extremely high. We unequivocally condemn the terror attacks by Hamas and other Palestinian militants in Israel on October the 7th, where more than 1,300 were killed, 3,600 wounded, and nearly 200 taken hostage, overwhelmingly civilians. Japan demands the immediate release of the hostages without conditions. We are particularly appalled by the destruction of Al-Ahari Arab Hospital yesterday, where hundreds died. We feel strong indignation at the tremendous damage and harm done to innocent civilians. Attacks against hospitals or civilians cannot be justified on any grounds. Japan expresses its heartfelt sympathy to the victims and injured and others, and offers its condolences to the bereaved families. It is vital that humanitarian aid reach the people of Gaza. Humanitarian corridors must be established so humanitarian actors can safely deliver food, water, fuel, and medicine to the population. We echo the Secretary General's call on Israel to ensure rapid and unimpeded access for humanitarian aid to reach those relying on this assistance for their survival. The risk of spillover, both regionally and globally, is real. We must choose a path that will bring us closer to peace, security, and stability. And in this vein, Japan welcomes President Biden's visit to Israel, as well as engagement by other players, including Secretary General and UN agencies, that could urgently address the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. We also encourage regional and other players to continue their efforts in negotiating the release of the hostages. For our part, Japan is engaging with other Council members to find common ground and take actions toward alleviating the plight of people in Gaza and preventing further escalation. Whatever the position of respective member states toward the peace process in the Middle East, one thing remains clear. No one wants to witness further loss of lives of the innocent. We must act without further delay. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking Under-Secretary General Griffiths and Special Coordinator Wennesland for their sobering briefings. And through you, may I also thank your teams who are working tirelessly in the region, including in the face of considerable personal risk. And again, we extend our condolences to those who have lost their lives. President, the UK is shocked and deeply saddened by the destruction and the hundreds of lives that were lost and people who were killed at the Al-Ahli hospital in Gaza yesterday evening. This is a devastating loss of life, and our thoughts and prayers are with those who were impacted. The UK is working intensively to establish the facts. But fundamentally, hospitals are protected under international law and should not be targeted. President, as I've said, Israel has the right under the UN Charter to defend itself against Hamas' appalling terror attacks. We have also emphasised that every feasible precaution must be taken to minimise harm to civilians, and we continue to call for immediate, unimpeded humanitarian access to enable essential aid, water, food and medicines to reach civilians. Israel has itself acknowledged that it must act in accordance with international humanitarian law. President, the UK is clear that Hamas does not speak for the Palestinian people. Humanitarian support and access must be maintained into Gaza. To support that effort, we have announced a further £10 million in UK humanitarian support. And we call for the opening of the Rafah crossing and guarantees of security for any foreign nationals who wish to cross, as well as for vital humanitarian aid entering. President, we're also clear that we must avoid further escalation of any conflict in the region. That is why the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary have been working urgently to engage Israeli, Palestinian and regional leaders. President, the UK will continue to work with partners in the international community to break the cycle of violence across Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories and work towards the peace and security of Israelis and Palestinians. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Special Coordinator Wennesland and USG Griffiths for their sobering briefings. The Middle East is in danger, one that we have not witnessed for decades. The dire humanitarian situation, as we heard, needs no explanation. The world is still in shock by the heinous and indefensible terrorist attack of Hamas and its consequences, including some 200 hostages. Given the brutality of attacks everyone has witnessed, there is reason to believe that the innocent people affected, if still alive, are kept somewhere in Gaza under conditions hard to imagine and describe. We strongly condemn such acts and reiterate our call for their immediate and unconditional release. Albania strongly condemns the terrorist attacks of Hamas and reiterates the call for a global condemnation of terror anywhere, by anyone, anytime. Terror cannot be justified. It cannot be excused. It should not be condoned. It should not be applauded, and it should not be glorified. It must only be condemned, and by all, it must be fought. It must be eradicated. We have said it many, many times. Violence breeds violence. But let's not forget, Hamas is not only harming Israelis, it is harming in the very same way innocent Palestinians. Hamas is responsible for what is happening in Gaza. It wants and works to destroy Israel, but by doing so, it's also destroying the future of Palestine, and it's shattering the dreams of Palestinians for self-determination, obstructing the hopes of Palestinian statehood that Palestinian people deserve and that the international community rightly supports. Albania has always stood by any state to defend themselves, and in this case, it supports the right of Israel for self-defense and its legitimate right to provide security for its people in a proportional manner, in line with the principles of the UN Charter, while taking every precaution not to harm innocent civilians. Mr. President, the war against terror should not harm civilians. The innocent people in Gaza are fully entitled to care and protection. Human lives have the same value, be they Israeli or Palestinian. They both deserve to live in peace and security. The explosion of the hospital in Gaza is a tragedy. We extend our condolences to all those affected, and we mourn the patients, medical staff, and other innocent killed or wounded in this tragedy. Nothing can justify striking a hospital, and nothing can justify targeting civilians. Everything must be done to allow the humanitarian assistance to reach everyone in need. We call for the opening of humanitarian routes and the assistance to flow unhindered for anyone in need. Colleagues, as in every conflict, in the absence of independently verified facts, guilt shifts sides, amplified nowadays like never before by social media. We must stick to facts, not judged by emotions. Therefore, all the light must be shed on the hospital attack. Facts have to be established and perpetrators must be held to account. Colleagues, in less than 2 weeks, thousands of Israelis and Palestinians have been killed. Innocent people are taken hostage. Thousands of rockets have been launched indiscriminately in Israel, and Gaza is being destroyed. Peace and security in the entire Middle East are under threat, and the risk of larger conflagration is real. Words of peace and calls for calm and reason may not be heard because of the noise of the war. But we should never, ever resign from efforts to bring the peace process back on track whenever this is possible. The regional and international actors must continue their efforts in order to respond quickly and wisely to the new reality and avoid the crisis spillover in the region and beyond. For us, there is no alternative. There can be no other possible solution than the one we have always supported and embraced. 2 democratic states, Israel and Palestine, for 2 people, Israelis and Palestinians living side by side in peace, security, and dignity. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President, for convening this emergency session. I also thank Special Coordinator Wennesland and USG Griffiths for the sobering briefings. All words will fall short as describing the horror that befell the Ali Baptist Hospital and the people of Gaza yesterday. One missile strike ended the lives of hundreds of people, all of whom were already acutely vulnerable. Malta condemns this action in the harshest terms. It tragically illustrates that there are no safe zones in Gaza. The Gazan population has nowhere to go. Many women and children, believing hospitals to be sanctuaries, have sought refuge within their confines, trusting in their status as protected spaces. While we recall the terror perpetrated by Hamas, as we speak, countless civilians in Gaza are devoid of basic amenities like running water or electricity. There is growing concern of dehydration and waterborne diseases, given the collapse of water and sanitation services. People are turning to UNRWA schools and hospitals throughout the area, seeking assurances of safety. It is imperative that this safety is assured. Safe zones must be immediately established and respected by all parties. The scale of the tragedy unfolding is a direct result of the chaos and devastation that permeates a conflict when international rules and norms are trampled upon. It is the international community's responsibility to make sure that these rules that are enshrined in international law guide our way forward. We stress that those with influence over the parties must underline the importance of respecting international humanitarian law. In this regard, Malta urges for an immediate humanitarian pause to take place. Humanitarian corridors also desperately need to be established to ensure that millions of civilians in Gaza are met with core necessities, including water, food, and medicine. It is an obligation of all parties to conflict to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. Parties must ensure that UN, ICRC, and humanitarian personnel are heeded full protection in their priceless work. We are distressed to learn that since 7th October, several aid workers have lost their lives to this war. We call for the establishment of an effective humanitarian notification system to be established in Gaza to protect civilians and aid workers alike. We cannot fail to underline the heroic work being undertaken by UNRWA. The agency operates in highly dangerous situations, going over and above their operational capacity. Malta condemned the deadly attack on an UNRWA school in Al-Maghzi, which also took place yesterday. Malta will be doubling its contribution to UNRWA. And we call for donors to step up their contributions, as many have done already. President, Malta is gravely alarmed at the growing risks of regional escalation due to this unprecedented war. It is critical that we prevent a regional spillover which would destabilize the entire region. We are concerned at the upsurge of violence in the West Bank, where over 60 Palestinians, including 16 children, have also been killed since 7 October. Dangerous skirmishes along the blue line between Lebanon and Israel are also deeply worrying and need to cease immediately. We call for all parties to exercise the utmost restraint and commit to a full de-escalation to avoid further human suffering and devastation. In the midst of this dark period, it is our responsibility to remain determined in ensuring that a just and comprehensive resolution to the Middle East conflict encapsulates all our efforts moving forward. We remain firm in our belief that this can only be achieved through a just and comprehensive resolution based on a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states, living side by side in peace and security, in line with the relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. It is crucial for the Israeli and Palestinian peoples and for our shared humanity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Special Coordinator Winsland and Undersecretary General Griffiths, for your sobering briefings. Colleagues, President Biden just spoke to these issues in Israel, and he has made clear the United States is outraged and saddened by the explosion at the El Ali Hospital in Gaza. We mourn this terrible loss of life. We mourn all the innocent civilians killed or wounded in this tragedy. Today, all of our hearts are heavy. My heart is heavy, and it is with the victims and the victims' loved ones. I cannot imagine the pain, the grief, the anguish they are going through. Last night, President Biden directed his national security team to continue gathering information about what exactly happened. While we continue to collect information, our current assessment, based on analysis of overhead imagery, intercepts, and open source information, is that Israel is not responsible for the explosion at the hospital in Gaza yesterday. Colleagues, the President has made clear, as I have in this Council, that we stand unequivocally for the protection of civilian life during conflict, unequivocally, in this conflict and in any conflict. We have communicated at the highest levels that every step must be taken to protect civilian lives, every step. In the face of this horrific tragedy, we stand with Palestinians in Gaza who are suffering through no fault of their own. Let us not lose sight of the fact that Hamas bears responsibility for this war. By slaughtering Israeli civilians and continuing to attack Israel, Hamas has wrought misery and destruction on Palestinians and the region, and it has done so for decades. Colleagues, as you know, Secretary General Guterres is on his way to the region, and President Biden and Secretary Blinken are on the ground and are deeply engaged on this issue. Just today, President Biden announced that the United States is providing $100 million in humanitarian assistance for Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. This money will support over 1 million displaced and conflict-affected Palestinians. Colleagues, the United States will continue to work closely with the Israeli government, other countries in the region, the United Nations, and other partners to minimize the risk of civilian casualties. The loss of any innocent life is heartbreaking and unacceptable, and we must all do everything possible to protect civilians. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Mozambique thanks Russia and the United Arab Emirates for convening this meeting. We also appreciate your readiness to schedule it. We thank both Mr. Tor Wensley, Special Coordinator for Middle East Peace Process, and Mr. Martin Griffiths, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, for their briefings on the latest developments in the region, particularly in Gaza Strip, and we convey our profound appreciation and solidarity for their dedication in these difficult moments. Mr. President, in just 11 days, the conflict between Israel and Hamas has caused significant damage to public infrastructure, including hospitals and schools, and has resulted in the displacement of thousands of people. We could not be more than horrified by the airstrike on the hospital in Gaza City on Tuesday night, where hundreds of people are reportedly killed and thousands of civilians were reportedly sheltering. Furthermore, attacks to those who have the responsibility to take care of others, such as medical personnel, is a flagrant violation of the international humanitarian law, and it can be perceived as war crimes. Needless to say that the situation has been further exacerbated by Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip, leading to a shortage of basic necessities such as food, water, medical supplies, just to mention but a few. We strongly condemn the attacks to the civilian population, mainly children, women, and the elderly who suffer the most from the atrocities and grave effects of this war. In this regard, we reiterate our call loudly and clearly to the parties to de-escalate the tension, stop the bloodshed, halt the attacks, and stop the human suffering in the occupied territories in Gaza Strip. We should ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches desperate citizens immediately and unconditionally. As it is been described, the humanitarian situation is indeed dire, and it is reaching unprecedented levels of alarm. We fear that the humanitarian catastrophe will continue to unfold in Gaza. We therefore call on the international community to ensure respect for the fundamentals of international law and the protection of civilians. Mr. President, we all know that the Israel-Palestinian conflict has been ongoing for decades, and it is a complex issue that requires a multifaceted approach to resolve. In fact, there have been many grassroots peace-building efforts between Israelis and Palestinians which have shown promise in fostering peaceful coexistence. It is therefore our firm belief that Israel and Palestine can only resolve their difference through peace and dialogue. We hold the view that peace is always possible if the conflicting parties are genuinely willing to follow the path of justice and tolerance. Concurrently, we resolutely reiterate our appeal to the members of this Council to redouble their role of influence toward a sustainable solution to the Palestinian situation in full compliance with the relevant resolutions, decisions, and other instruments of the United Nations. To conclude, Mr. President, we urge the parties to pursue the path of dialogue and constructively together towards a lasting peace, respecting the rights of self-determination of the Palestinian people and the two-state solution in accordance with the Security Council resolutions 242 and 2334 of 2016. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I'd also like to thank our briefers, Martin and Tor, for their invaluable remarks and insights today, and to thank them for all the fantastic work they are doing in very difficult circumstances. This morning's explanation of vote of the United Arab Emirates outlined our overall position on the matter in front of us. But in this briefing, which we called for with China and the Russian Federation, we really just wanted to focus concretely on the humanitarian situation, which is getting worse by the day. Because for nearly 2 weeks, we have borne witness to the relentless and indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza following the heinous attack on Israel on the 7th of October. In Gaza, as a result, 1 million people are now displaced and more than 500,000 people are sheltering in UN facilities, and the UN system is not equipped for this response. There are reports of bombs being dropped on UN schools and buildings where people are running to seeking safety. And as USG Undersecretary General Martin made clear in his statement, the humanitarian situation on the ground is now catastrophic. The evacuation order for over 1 million people to try to move to safety is, in these circumstances, an impossible demand that fails to comply with international law. And yesterday, the situation got worse. The world watched the unthinkable happen, an attack targeted against the Al Ahli Baptist Hospital, resulting in the death of more than 500 people. There's no ambiguity under international law in providing care to the wounded and sick. Hospitals and medical personnel must at all times be protected, and they must never, never be the target of an attack. Nothing can justify yesterday's attack, and we condemn it and call for an impartial and independent and transparent investigation into this tragedy, and for those responsible to be held accountable. Gaza has been under siege for 10 days, during which a stranglehold has been placed around the necks of the civilians there. The descriptions of the humanitarian situation on the ground from both Martin and Tor give us a sense of what hell on earth might look like. The steps that need to be taken are clear and practical. This morning, the President of the United Arab Emirates, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, discussed some of those steps with the United Nations Secretary General. We need an immediate cessation of hostilities, as called for in the resolution that failed to be adopted today. We need the unconditional release of all hostages being held, and their humane treatment. This must happen now. We need safe and unhindered access for all humanitarian aid workers, including medical aid, food, water and fuel, and humanitarian workers. I'm sure many of you are disturbed by the images of civilians in Gaza boiling toilet water to give to their families. The reconnection of electricity, water, and telecommunications must happen, and the protection of all civilians must be our priority. At Egypt's border with Gaza, life-saving humanitarian aid is piling up. The United Arab Emirates has opened an air bridge to transport the much-needed supplies, but without firm guarantees from all the parties that the trucks and civilians gathering to receive aid will not be targeted, they remain out of the hands of those who so desperately need them. The UAE's government has announced an additional $70 million in aid for Gaza. These protections must be put into place. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Gaza is deteriorating by the hour, and we must be under no illusions. We are staring into the abyss, not only in Gaza, but of what is now a widening regional conflagration. So we call today for a regional and international focus of this Council, of the international community, as well as renewed efforts around securing the de-escalation and cessation of hostilities on the ground. We really appreciate the diplomatic efforts of Egypt in this regard, as well as of the United States. In particular, Egypt's efforts to ensure safe humanitarian access in Gaza through the Rafah crossing and their convening of a summit of world leaders to address the deteriorating situation. We hope that today's announcement by the United States and by President Biden that Israel has agreed to allow humanitarian access via Rafah will result in the rapid and safe delivery of aid. There is no time to waste. Leaders across the region and the international community should focus all possible efforts to secure the cessation of hostilities. And as Tor said, the only way we can end these cycles of conflict is to rededicate all efforts towards a long-term political solution. The past 10 days cannot be undone, but our future remains before us to determine. How we act now to preserve our shared humanity, ensure respect for international humanitarian law, and alleviate the dire suffering of the people of Gaza will determine that course. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Brazil. I thank our dear briefers for their comments and commend them for their extraordinary work in a very difficult situation. I also ask them to please convey our thanks to their people on the ground. Brazil is appalled by the catastrophic strike on the Al-Ahli Arab hospital in Gaza City that killed hundreds of civilians. It is simply abominable. Hospitals and medical personnel are and must be effectively protected under international humanitarian law. Yesterday's attack shows again that the civilians are the ones paying the ultimate price for this conflict. We stand in solidarity with the grieving families of the victims and offer our deepest condolences. Brazil unequivocally condemns the terrorist attacks and hostage taken by Hamas in Israel on October 7th. Acts of terrorism are unjustifiable regardless of their motivation, whenever and by whomever they are committed. We all call in the strongest terms for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and demand their safety, well-being, and humane treatment in accordance with international law. Any military response to terrorist acts or acts of aggression must be conducted strictly in accordance with the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. The presence among the civilian population of individuals who may not qualify as civilians under international humanitarian law does not deprive the broader population of its civilian status. In addition to hospitals, airstrikes and the reckless use of heavy weapons such as missiles and shelling have also hit schools such as the UNRWA facility in Al-Maghazi refugee camp, resulting in tragic loss of life. The targeted UNRWA school had sheltered at least 4,000 people since October the 7th. This is unacceptable. Brazil urges the protection of civilians, humanitarian workers, including UN staff and assets and health facilities. We also condemn actions and decisions that have deprived the civilian population of Gaza of essential means of survival in violation of international humanitarian law. We urge the cessation of actions that result in the forcible transfer of civilians and actions that are inconsistent with international law. The imposition of such measures, particularly in conflict zones, only exacerbates the humanitarian crisis and further endangers lives, and it will fuel the conflict even more. The immediate objective is clear and urgent: to prevent further bloodshed and loss of life, and to try to ensure urgent and unimpeded humanitarian access to the affected areas. A humanitarian pause is urgent. Efforts should aim at a cessation of hostilities that would help to ensure the protection of civilians both in Israel and Palestine. To save succeeding generations from the scourge of war are among the very first words of the United Nations Charter, and these words were the primary motivation for the creation of the United Nations. How the United Nations, and the Security Council in particular, deals with the current humanitarian catastrophe will say a great deal about the future of the United Nations and multilateralism as a whole. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, there is no right to commit massacres in international law. Israel is perpetrating massacres in Gaza every single day. For over 10 days now, you have witnessed it killing entire families, bomb shelters, schools, hospitals, residential buildings, convoys. You have heard it telling people to head south of Gaza and then bomb the south. You have heard and seen it telling people they had a choice between forced displacement and death, and then subject them to both. It is beyond belief that some still speak of a right to self-defense of an occupying power that has made clear it is seeking blind vengeance, forced transfer, and annihilation of our people. You will all say civilian lives should be protected, and yet some of you, until now, continue being unable to call for a stop to the assault, to call for an immediate ceasefire. Those who cannot or will not call for a ceasefire will lose any credibility, any authority, and share some of the responsibility for the devastation that is occurring now. And what will occur next? And no one should want to be seen as complicit in these mass killings or their continuation. Had this council called for a ceasefire 2 days ago and acted accordingly, it would have saved hundreds of lives. Maybe, for some, saving hundreds of Palestinian lives is not such an important objective to pursue. But are you sure that Palestinian lives are the only ones you would be saving if you act? We told this council months ago, act to save lives, all lives. You did not hear us then. Don't make the same mistake now. Mr. President, people are being killed as we speak. A humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented proportion is unfolding in Gaza live on TV screens. And we heard what Mr. Griffith said. A political disaster is underway, and yet the Security Council of the United Nations is unable to say the only thing that truly matters. Stop the bloodshed. I repeat, stop the bloodshed. For those who think they can avert a humanitarian catastrophe and a regional spillover while Israel continues bombing and killing Palestinians, think again. The region is united in telling you it is not possible. Listen to them. The only way to prevent both is to stop this criminal aggression against our people. Mr. President, there is no speech, no legal contortion, no political cover that can clear Israel of its responsibility for the Palestinian civilians it is killing. For 75 years now, Israel has explained, brazenly justified, how it had to dispossess us, how it had to occupy our land, how it had to kill our people, all in full impunity. Killing more Palestinians will never make Israel more secure. 75 years of experience should have been proof enough for those who want to learn. There is no logic in this world, no moral in this world, and no law in this world that can justify the killing of a people. Innocent children, women and men, as a pretext to make another one secure. The whole world is watching. They're watching us. The events of the last 10 days may shape the next 10 years in our region and beyond. What happens next is decisive. If anyone thinks this is a situation under control for which you can plan and implement, they are making false and irresponsible assumptions. This is the kind of war where you know how it starts and have no clue how it ends. Until now, it can be stopped, and it should be stopped immediately. Any further delay is a risk no one should take. The Council should have met today to heed the call of the Secretary General, of religious leaders around the world, including the Pope, of the Arab states, of the Muslim countries, of the global South, of the overwhelming number of states around the world, of billions of people, including the millions who marched in your streets. Stop the bloodshed, stop it now. Stop the bloodshed, stop it now. Listen to them. But it has not heeded these calls. It has not upheld international law unequivocally, equally, and responsibly. And in the next few hours, more Palestinians will be killed. Tensions in the region will rise to new dangerous levels. Anger and resentment will explode. Each one of us will be asked what we did when all of this was happening. All will be asked what they did to prevent what will happen next. The Council's failure to shoulder its responsibilities after 10 days of Israeli massacres against the Palestinian people, and after the killing of hundreds of people gathered in a hospital to find shelter and care, will mark public opinions in our region and the world for a very long time, and affect belief in the protections of the law for all people, as well as their perceptions and reactions. This was not a moment to foster more despair and more impunity. This was not a moment to make the same mistakes that got us here in the first place. Finally, Israel does not deny that it killed entire families, infants, children, their parents, uncles and aunts and cousins, their grandparents, with sometimes up to 45 members of the same family being slaughtered. It has done so repeatedly through the years, and doing it again this time in the Gaza Strip. It has now killed 3,500 Palestinians, almost all civilians, including more than 1,000 children. It admitted it was killing all of them, but urged it could not do otherwise. Their deaths were not its fault, even though it killed them. But the hospital massacre had such an impact on global public opinion that it had to change tactics and change its original story into a new one. So Israel will deny responsibility for the massacre in the Baptist Hospital Al-Ahli, just as it made every effort to deny its responsibility in the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh and Muhammad al-Durra, and in the many massacres it had perpetrated over the decades, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. It will blame the Palestinians for their own death, as it has always done, and it will attempt to present evidence to that effect to this Council. Remember, the last time somebody presented evidence in this chamber to justify war. Do you remember that? Somebody came with technological devices and pictures and what have you to convince you of evidence. Remember the last time somebody presented evidence in this chamber to justify war. I am sure the Council, the media, and the world will not be fooled by such theater again. These are serious times. They require serious and responsible leadership, one this Council has failed to provide. Some members here are losing an opportunity to change our region for the better. Whatever their calculations, they are wrong. May they change course before it is too late. Reality on the ground will overtake any plans you may have. Shaping it or enduring it is a decision that needs to be made now. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished Council members, what is going on here? I'm truly shocked. I'm horrified. I truly don't understand what is going on here. The most barbaric and wide-scale terror attack in decades, bigger than 9/11, was perpetrated 11 days ago, and it seems like this Council has already forgotten. The pictures and footage from the October 7th pogrom are seared into my brain, in every Israeli's brain, forever. But it seems that I must remind some of you of what happened. Thousands of barbaric Hamas Nazis invaded Israel and brutally murdered 1,400 innocent Israelis as they slept, celebrated, hugged their families in fear, and cried for mercy. Some were raped, others beheaded, and some were burned alive while bound and gagged. Many were children, and hundreds were young people at a music festival. There were many paramedics, talking about medical teams, many paramedics who were murdered on their way to treat the wounded, mothers who watched as their babies were slaughtered, and elderly Holocaust survivors who endured the Nazis only to be executed in their own living room. This was planned and carried out deliberately by the terrorists that rule Gaza today, as we speak. Not by accident, not by mistake, but deliberately. 200 innocents were violently taken hostage, many of which are nationals of your own countries. I read Hamas's charter aloud to you just 2 days ago. Hamas's words were not empty threats. Hamas's charter is their action plan. Their goal is the annihilation of Israel. And if Hamas has the opportunity to commit these atrocities again, they will, and you know it. Although there are some here that choose not to designate Hamas as a terror organization for political reasons, it still doesn't change the facts. Hamas deliberately targets civilians and massacres children when given the chance. This makes Hamas a terror organization, no different than ISIS. They do not believe in dialogue, they don't want a dialogue, not in political solutions. They only believe in exterminating Jews and annihilating the Jewish state. And nothing can change their genocidal ideology. They don't even recognize the existence of international law. To all those who are talking about two-state solution and international law, there is only one solution to curing a cancer, and it is the evisceration of every cancerous cell, just as was done with ISIS and Al-Qaeda, complete obliteration. This is the only way to ensure such atrocities will never be repeated. Nevertheless, look at what is going on here. 11 days after ISIS-like Hamas terrorists attempted to carry out another Jewish genocide, this council is not even focused on their heinous crimes. Up until today, you have not even done the most basic thing. You have not condemned, as a council, Hamas's brutal terror attack. It is really unfathomable. You cannot unite even on that basic thing. You are not focused on what needs to be done to free Gaza from Hamas and ensure that the oppression of the Gazan people by their tyrants ends. Instead, the Council is fixated only on humanitarian corridors and aid. These are important and noble causes, but they are certainly not a solution to prevent Hamas's next atrocious massacre. How is it possible that you are only dealing with resolutions like the one that was voted upon today? It's tragic to say, but this council is playing the exact role that Hamas was written for it in their script of death and terror. And I will explain. Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza 18 years ago. Hamas was then elected by the people of Gaza. I hear a lot that they do not represent them. Elected. And after murdering the Palestinian Authority officials by throwing them off rooftops, Hamas proceeded to convert every inch of the Gaza Strip to a war machine. Where was the council then? Where was the council when Hamas exploited the billions of dollars in international aid to embed terror infrastructure within and below densely populated residential areas? Where were you? Where was the UN? The UN knew all of this, but it remained silent. Hamas then spent the following 17 years terrorizing Israel by firing tens of thousands of rockets indiscriminately at Israeli towns and cities, while hiding behind their own civilians. Where has the Council been? As we speak, right now, sirens are wailing. Millions in Israel are running to find shelters. Hamas does this so that once Israel strikes back, they can parade the bodies of the civilians in Gaza that they hid behind. Their strategy is to exploit their civilian casualties as propaganda, to leverage the international community to tie Israel's hands. Their goal is to increase civilian casualties in Gaza. This is part of their script. They know that they cannot beat Israel on the battlefield. Of course they know it. So they want to terrorize our citizens deliberately, only citizens, and then weaponize the UN to prevent Israel from obliterating them so they can rebuild, rearm, and continue terrorizing Israelis. They have a lot of patience while working towards annihilating Israel, a lot of patience. This is Hamas's script. This is their playbook. And shockingly, even after the recent slaughter, it's still working for them. Do you not understand that just by holding this session with its focus, the Council is showing Hamas that they can fool everyone again and again and again? I reiterate, so far this Council has not even condemned Hamas for the atrocity it perpetrated, let alone held Hamas fully responsible for the situation in Gaza. But here we are, discussing humanitarian corridors. Does nobody else see how ludicrous this is? Calling for calm, restraint, and ceasefires is like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Such steps will not eradicate the cancer that is Hamas. Humanitarian corridors will not prevent the next atrocity. The only thing that will is the utter obliteration of this satanic entity. What are you doing to prevent this evil? Perhaps if for once the Council condemned Hamas, the people of Gaza would begin to comprehend the absolute destruction their leaders have brought upon them. Perhaps they would stand up to these barbaric savages. Yet every time the international community pressures Israel and attempts to tie our hands, it only serves to embolden these genocidal terrorists, increases their popularity, and ensure that this evil lives to see another day. Distinguished Council members, perhaps the most fundamental part of this issue is that some have still not internalized what Hamas truly is. This emergency session and the resolution voted upon were triggered, we all know it, by the propaganda of savage jihadists. Let that sink in. Claims made by baby-killing terrorists were accepted here and repeated today, by the way, at face value, without a second thought. And this is what triggered this session. Every piece of information that comes out of Gaza cannot be trusted. Hamas runs Gaza. Hamas runs all Gazan institutions. So whatever comes out of the Strip is not the truth. It is what Hamas wants you to hear. Sadly, transparency and the truth are not central values for genocidal terrorists. In August 2022, Sarah Mascroft, the former head of office for OCHA in Gaza, tweeted a condemnation of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad for their indiscriminate rocket fire at Israeli civilians. August 2022, you can check. Almost immediately, Ms. Mascroft, the head of OCHA, was removed from her post and deleted her tweet. This made Israel very upset, obviously, so I asked her boss, I hope he's still with us, Under-Secretary General Griffith, UN would remove an official from their post for condemning acts of terror that deserve UN condemnation. Do you know what he told me? He said that Ms. Mascroft was transferred because, according to UN information and assessments, there was danger to her life. Danger to her life. If a UN official received death threats for telling the truth about the terrorists, try to imagine how any Gazan feels about telling the truth. Not only are official Gazan sources absolutely unreliable as they are terrorists, they would also be immediately murdered if they say something that Hamas doesn't like. So, distinguished council member, I have to ask you a question. What does this say about whoever decides to believe the claims of a terror organization without any fact-checking? The Al-Ahli hospital was hit by, and only by, a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket. What happened yesterday, including the tragic loss of life of civilians, was the sole fault of Hamas. Israel has lots of footage and even an audio recording from Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorists to prove this beyond a fraction of a doubt. Nevertheless, the Secretary General and numerous UN officials immediately accepted the claims of baby-killing terrorists. What a disgrace. And today, some of you repeated these lies. How can the Secretary General forget that he has the obligation to verify the facts before issuing a condemnation? I guess it's easy when it comes to Israel. Mere months ago, the Secretary General himself signed off on a report detailing how the misfired rockets of Gazan terrorists killed and maimed dozens of Gazan children and medical personnel. We demand an apology. An apology. The UN and some on this council rushed to adopt the lies of ISIS-like terrorists and refused to accept the hard evidence of a law-abiding democracy. You should apologize. Apologize for never convening the council when Hamas rockets are fired deliberately at Israeli hospitals. Barzilai Hospital in Ashkelon was directly hit by a Hamas rockets just last week. Where was the council? Apologize for years of putting your heads in the ground while Hamas ceaselessly built up its war machine in Gaza. Distinguished council members, stop following Hamas's script. Stop playing by Hamas's rules. The time has come for this council to hold Hamas fully and solely accountable for the war crimes committed. This council should be purely focused on condemning the Hamas terrorists, supporting Israel's right to defend itself, and demanding from Hamas to immediately and unconditionally return our hostages. Israel's rescue mission can end very quickly if Hamas terrorists turn themselves in and release all of the hostages. But this rescue mission will not end until Israel ensures that Hamas atrocities can never be repeated again. And there is no way to ensure this other than the obliteration of Hamas's capabilities. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. Before giving the floor to the next speaker, I would like to say the following. To ensure that all speakers enjoy the same sizable audience, I strongly recommend that statements do not exceed 5 minutes, if possible. I now give the floor to the representative of Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I make this statement on behalf of the Arab group against the backdrop of the tragic events in Gaza, where we lack the fair voice of the international community and any active and effective international action to protect the Palestinian people in Gaza. The Arab group condemned in the strongest words the heinous massacre by the IDF, the criminal IDF, yesterday against the innocent civilians who were receiving care in Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza. The Arab group holds Israel, the occupying power, the sole responsibility for this heinous war crime, that we cannot remain silent about it. We call on the Security Council to take immediate action for immediate ceasefire and the Israeli aggression on Gaza. We call to ensure that humanitarian and medical aid enters the Strip and provide the protection to medical staff and relief staff and medical education and UN facilities. And we also call for preventing the forcible displacement of the people of Gaza. Mr. President, the heinous crimes of the occupation are contravening with rules of international law, in particular Geneva Fourth Convention in relation to the protection of civilians during armed conflicts. That's in addition to the provisions of the UN Charter and international legitimacy. We recall the Security Council Resolution 2286 that provides that those working in the medical field and healthcare should not be targeted, and it condemns all attacks against the medical staff and calls for providing the adequate protection. Mr. President, the Arab group calls for holding Israel accountable, Israel, the occupying power, for the massacres and crimes it continues to commit against the defenseless Palestinian people. The targeting by Israel of the Baptist Ahli Hospital is not coming out of vacuum. As we mentioned before, the pronouncements from the Israeli officials was clear. It indicated that Israel will not protect, it will not respect the humanitarian and moral values which sees that hospitals should be evicted. That triggered response from the WHO and different UN entities. They confirmed that the forced eviction and targeting of medical facilities and staff are severe violations to international humanitarian law. In relation to what was said by Martin Griffith a short while ago, a warning has been issued by Israeli authorities to 20 medical institutions, including the Baptist Hospital. That is shortly before the attack on the hospital. In this connection, we stress that the heinous crimes against the people of Gaza are crimes against the humanity of all of us. Condemning this attack is a humanitarian call, purely humanitarian call, that makes it incumbent upon us to unify, to put an end to this war and to provide the necessary international protection to the Palestinian people immediately. The Arab group warns that this war against the innocent civilians has entered a serious phase that will take the region to a disaster. The international community and the Security Council should assume its responsibility in maintaining international peace and security by putting an end and the killing of children, women, and elderly. We stress that we will be the advocate defenders of the rights of Palestinians and their just cause, and we stress that the reason behind the conflict is this occupation. If we want peace and security, the Palestinian cause should be resolved with the establishment of the independent Palestinian state along the borders of June 1967 with its Jerusalem as its capital and according to international resolutions and the Arab peace initiatives. In conclusion, we express our heartfelt condolences to the families of the martyrs, and we call God to have mercy on them and to grant recovery to those who are wounded and injured. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Jordan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
شكرا سيد الرئيس وهنئكم على تولي رئاسة المجلس وأشكر مارتن جريفيث.
Thank you, President. I should like to congratulate you upon assuming the presidency of the Security Council. I'd like to thank Martin. I'd like to thank Tor Vintland. Thank you for your briefings. Furthermore, thank you the UAE and the Russian Federation, which asked for this emergency session of the Council to be convened in light of the Israeli bombing of the Baptist hospital, Al-Ahli Hospital, in the Gaza Strip. This was part and parcel of an attempt to uproot the Palestinian people, forcing it to leave its territory. This crime committed on the 17th of October is a new chapter in a long series of violations, which did not begin on the 8th of October. They began much earlier than that. They began when the occupation began. This requires the international community to put an end to its current policy and begin to hold to account an illegal political session. Everyone who commissioned, participated, called for, and ordered these crimes, the crimes committed yesterday included. The events underway in Palestine call on us to shoulder our responsibility. And we're all well aware that our friends, Brazil, will be able to shoulder its responsibility and fulfill these duties as part of their presidential duties. And this is necessary because what's going on, it poses unimaginable risks to the region and to international peace and security. These risks cannot be ruled out. Therefore, we warned against and took action to avoid these risks on numerous occasions. The occupation cannot go on. These crimes cannot be overlooked. Unilateral measures taken, specifically the broadening and extending of the illegitimate, illegal settlements, the crimes being committed, the desecration of holy sites, the political deadlock owing to Israel's intransigence, the condescending fashion with which Israel treats international law, all of this is fuel to the fire. We must ensure that no one uses what we've just said as a pretext. They shouldn't recycle narratives accusing us of terrorism. We'd like to, therefore, reiterate, speaking before you, speaking before this august assembly, speaking before the world, our categorical rejection and direct condemnation of all acts which involve taking of civilian hostages. This is a position which we expressed. We did this clearly. And all Arab states have, in fact, expressed their position very clearly at the ministerial meeting of the Council of the League of Arab States earlier this year. Mr. President, we condemned civilians being targeted. We've condemned this, and we also have condemned the double standards we've seen. We condemn civilians being targeted, our brothers in occupied Palestine being targeted. We'd like to reiterate our condemnation and staunch rejection of all crimes being committed by Israel against the Palestinian people. The latest such crime is the targeting of Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital yesterday. We'd like to reaffirm our rejection of Israel's attempts to evade responsibility and attempts taken by certain international parties to cover for Israel by providing false excuses. And this is what resulted in the impossible situation we have on our hands in Palestinian territory in the Gaza Strip. We see civilians being bombarded in their homes, in hospitals, because of the ongoing refusal to adopt initiatives geared towards ensuring calm and political initiatives as well. Unless the international community shoulders its share of responsibility in full, unless this august council shoulders its full share of responsibility vis-à-vis this explosive situation, we won't have a clear vision of the procedure that's required. And we do have a clear vision. We need an immediate and unconditional cessation of hostilities. And we are surprised. This is the ordinary procedure which applies in all armed conflicts. Nevertheless, we don't see the same level of commitment geared towards achieving this in Gaza, despite the risk of the conflict spilling over. There are some states which have not done their utmost to achieve a ceasefire, but we must say that they will not necessarily be spared these risks. This might fuel the flames of conflict. Second, we need to guarantee the protection of civilians. We need to furnish humanitarian assistance to civilians. We were equally taken aback to see that this principle, which is one of the most fundamental principles of humanity, the fact that we're debating this principle, the fact that it is controversial when the protection of civilians in armed conflicts is one of the pillars of international law. It is, in fact, one of the pillars of humanity. We must therefore immediately cease targeting medical institutions, which is something that's been condemned by various UN Security Council resolutions, such as Resolution 2286, which condemns all violence and acts committed against hospitals and other medical facilities. We also need to immediately abolish the evacuation order. That's what Israel calls it. This is one of the most abominable instances of forced transfer of populations in the modern era. This is a fallacious justification which Israel claims to be a means of protecting civilians. Third, we must put an end to hate speech, to justification of crimes committed against the Palestinian people, to their demonization. Animals. This is a term that was used by an official of a country which claims to be democratic. This description, these words, were not commented on by other states which continuously talk about the principles of humanity. This kind of speech poisons our minds and fuels conflict. Fourth, we need to do our utmost, deploy all efforts to free detainees, hostages, and ensure they're treated in keeping with international law and the principle of humanity. Mr. Chairman, Egypt, ever since the latest conflict began, has been working as part of its historic role to help the Palestinian people and restore peace. We're working with this vision in mind. We want to establish a ceasefire by taking measures to uphold and guarantee humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip and to mobilize sufficient aid. Egypt also called for the convening of an emergency summit in Cairo on the 21st of October with the participation of all international parties and regional parties affected by the crisis. Under these very pressing circumstances, given the risk of escalation, in order to overcome this crisis and somehow pave the way for a lasting, comprehensive and fair solution, we stand convinced that simply managing the crisis, circumscribing the aspirations of the Palestinian people, is an approach which should be consigned to history. Mr. President, Egypt, the Egyptian people all over the world have their eyes on you. The eyes of the world are on you, on the Security Council, so that the Security Council shoulders its responsibility, puts an end to this war which was waged by Israel against Palestinian territories and against an innocent, unarmed people. And all this people wants is to enjoy its fundamental rights to freedom and to live in dignity in an independent state like all other peoples of the world. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Egypt for their statement. I insist that to ensure that all speakers enjoy the same sizable audience, we strongly recommend that statements do not exceed 5 minutes. And also for the sake of a good communication, that speakers speak in a tone of, in a rhythm that will allow a good translation and the good performance of our translators. Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Oman.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أدلي بهذا البيان نيابة عن الدول الأعضاء في مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية وهي
I'm making this statement on behalf of the members of the Operational Council, that is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, the State of Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, and the Sultanate of Oman, as I already said. Allow me at the outset to align myself with the statement that's just been delivered by the representative of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan on behalf of the Arab Group. I wish to congratulate you and your friendly country, Brazil, for the presidency of the Security Council this month. I wish you every success in your leadership of the work of this council in order to maintain international peace and security and to strengthen the status of international law and the credibility of this council. In parallel with the noble principles and the august aims of the United Nations Charter, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the council held a meeting a few days ago to review the developments in the situation in the Middle East, and particularly in the occupied Palestinian territories and the Gaza Strip, and to undertake measures and tangible, practical steps to maintain peace, security, and to avoid an escalation and the blood flowing. Unfortunately, this council wasn't able to take a resolution. The result is more murders, more destruction, increasing collective punishment, and innocent souls who have been killed. It is not a new situation, particularly with regard to Israel. For 75 years, this council, which is mandated by the international community, has been unable to find a solution, a lasting, comprehensive, fair solution to this situation on the basis of legal international law resolutions, on the basis of international law, including the resolutions adopted by this council itself, including Resolution 2243 and 2334. What we're seeing today is nothing new. It is the outcome of victims on both sides. The result is victims on both sides and a full lack of security. The cause of all this is two double standards, which has led Israel to rely on this council and its resolution, to defy this council and its resolutions. Once, time and again, it has perpetrated massacres against the Palestinian people. This people that have put their confidence, their trust in the international community. They put their trust in this council to provide necessary protection. The massacre of the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza, which to now counts 500 martyrs, most of whom are women, children, and older persons, as well as medical staff, not to mention the hundreds of wounded, is a dangerous escalation.
Isn't this a violation of international law? Isn't this a violation of international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions of 1949? Isn't Israel here an occupying state in the Palestinian territory which has a responsibility to protect civilians in the time of war? Haven't they killed this unimaginable number of human beings, torn them to pieces before the eyes of the world? Isn't this a criminal terrorist act, a flagrant violation of international law? Allow me now to refer to what was already mentioned by the Euro-Mediterranean Observatory for Human Rights. They said that the Israeli army launched missiles on the Gaza Strip over the last few days. This is similar in scale to a quarter of a nuclear bomb. Killing many Palestinians every hour. This is a pursued cycle of violence that has destroyed 17,000 residential buildings, more than 87,000 residential units. Added to that, we see the destruction of schools, 18 mosques, 165 other holy sites, and the number continues to increase. If this isn't a violation, if it isn't a massacre perpetrated against the Palestinian people, allow me to ask you then, when will the international community committed them will be brought to justice? We will ask them to be held to account for collective punishment, famine. These are criminal acts that are rejected, that have been practiced, but they were practiced by Nazis during the Second World War, and have no place today in today's world. The international community placed its trust in this August Council to guarantee non-repetition of what happened, to protect future generations from the scourge of war. We ask you, the international community asks you, as does the Palestinian people, to shoulder the responsibility that falls to you, this council. This council must act responsibly to maintain international peace and security, to protect civilians. We must bring an immediate end to any act of violence, to any illegal, random, blind bombing of residential Palestinian neighborhoods. We categorically, as Gulf countries, reject any plan for the forced transfer of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip, and we convey to Israel, as the occupying power, the full responsibility. We ask this council to pay heed to that and to pay heed to the potential repercussions to peace and security. The countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council insist on the importance of the immediate cessation of fire and for the enabling of immediate access for relief teams to the Gaza Strip. We need to take a decisive position against famine, water shortages, cutting off water and power, this which is used as a weapon of war. We would allow you to stand on the side of we'll ask you to stand on the side of international law, to ask for the lifting of the siege on the Gaza Strip, open crossing points, allow humanitarian workers and UN workers, particularly UNRWA, to have access. What are we expecting as the international community? What are we expecting to act far from double standards, from selectivity? Are we just waiting for more massacres, more torture? What are we waiting for? The measures that we need to take will be immortalized in this room, in history. And we would like to draw your attention to the fact that overlooking the path of reason and justice will not lend itself to the credibility of this Council and will never mean that we are able to ensure stability within the Middle East. Indeed, the contrary will be true. We call on you to apply international law. Prove to us that there are no states that are above the law, even if this state is Israel. We ask you to send a clear message, a loud, clear, direct message, citing the inevitable nature of peace for all parties. By way of conclusion, I would like to refer to the emergency meeting in Muscat, the capital of Oman, the ministerial meeting that was held yesterday to discuss the developments in occupied Palestinian territories. And I would like to refer to the communique calling for the stop of the escalation, respect for international law, protection of civilians, confirming the importance to bring an end to the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories, as well as the establishment of an independent Palestinian within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. The communique called on the international community to take immediate, effective steps to ensure that this becomes a reality pursuant to international law, and urge the international community to support the resilience of the Palestinian people on its land, while warning off any attempt to displace this people from its territory, and to guarantee a comprehensive solution under international law and the Arab Peace Initiative and the Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. We also asked for collective opposition to any attempt for the displacement of this crisis that has been worsened to neighboring countries. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Oman for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Libya.
السيد الرئيس في البداية ليبيا
President, at the outset, Libya would like to align itself with the statement delivered by the ambassador of Jordan on behalf of the Arab group, as well as the statement delivered on behalf of the GCC by Oman. We should like to express Libya's condemnation of the state and the people, and in the strongest possible terms, our condemnation of the atrocities, the atrocious aggression committed against the Baptist hospital in Gaza City yesterday. This is a murderous machine which is boasting about its power, the support it has garnered. It has taken hundreds of innocent martyrs, women and children, the sick, as well as medical personnel. This is a new chapter in a series of crimes to which the people of Gaza have been subjected. The question today is this a collective punishment, perhaps, which might constitute a crime against humanity? It seems that you're waiting for another Rwanda, in contravention of the principles of humanity and international humanitarian law. Unfortunately, Mr. President,
Western countries about human rights and international law. What message are you sending today to the world? The people of the world are not ignorant. So stop this double standard and stop this hypocrisy. سيد الرئيس، لقد تحول.
This council is tasked with upholding international peace and security. It is now engaged in a political competition. We regret that the Council was unable to adopt any resolution to put an end to this dangerous situation, because some states have been listening to silence, but actually they don't want to continue hearing the cries of women and innocent children in the Gaza Strip. They're being murdered, bombarded, besieged. They're seeing electricity cuts. They're not being furnished with humanitarian assistance. And they're also now being forcibly displaced. There are attempts to do this. These are war crimes, crimes against humanity. There are various attempts which have been taken to punish an entire people. Where is international law? Where is the international law? Libya had comments which it wanted to make on the resolutions tabled by the various members, by Russia, by Brazil. However, if we are to take serious steps within the Council, if we were to do this, if we had we adopted the Russian resolution 2 days ago, maybe we would have saved lives, the lives of children, the lives of innocent civilians who were put to death yesterday in the Baptist hospital. The unfortunate events unfolding before us are the logical product of a policy of racial discrimination being waged as part of the occupation of the Palestinian people. This policy denies them all of their rights as enshrined in international law and relevant resolutions. The same goes for the attacks on holy sites in Palestinian territory. The bloodbath has been happening for decades. Thousands of civilians have perished. This must end. Killing civilians, killing unarmed persons, this is something that is rejected and condemned under all international laws. The double standards policy, which has been adopted by many countries, especially the Western countries, must stop. You cannot be both judge and jury. You cannot boil the Palestinian issue down to what happened on the 7th of October. You have to see the broader context, the injustice, the colonization policies, the colonial policies which put to death the dream for peace. Over the last 75 years, colonies were planted in the occupied territories, and the international community knew full well about these. The unfair siege on this Gaza Strip. Well, the Gaza Strip became an open-air prison, the biggest prison in all humanity. Fair and lasting peace for the Palestinians is the only way to uphold international peace, security, and stability for the entire region and its people. We'd like to reiterate once again that we support the Palestinian people in their fight for resistance so that they can live in their territory. We abhor all territories, abhor all attempts to take action outside the territory, especially the pressure that it is being exerted. We do not want another Nakba. Israel expressed its unwavering unified position vis-à-vis the Palestinian cause. This is an issue which the Libyan people believe to be a cause for the entire nation. We see no solution aside from justice and the enjoyment of their rights by the Palestinian people with a Palestinian state with Jerusalem, East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Libya for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We align ourselves with the statement of Jordan on behalf of the Arab group. I would like to thank Mr. Tor Wensland and Martin Griffiths for their briefings. Also, we express our wholehearted condolences to the fraternal Palestinian people in the aftermath of the brutal aggression perpetrated by the occupying forces, which violated all international instruments. This is a new link in a chain of atrocities and massacres that are perpetrated every single day against the Palestinian people amidst a deafening silence of the international community. The occupation forces perpetrated an atrocious and heinous crime by bombarding the National Baptist Hospital. This is a barbaric carnage that claimed the lives of hundreds of innocent civilians, including women, children, medical and paramedical personnel. We do stress again that This is yet another example of the contempt by the occupying power of all international and humanitarian instruments. Tunisia expresses its condemnation in the strongest terms of this cowardly aggression against Palestinian civilians, and we call for putting an end to impunity in the case of war crimes and genocide, those crimes that are assiduously and presumptuously perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinian people. We call upon all the countries of the international community to shoulder their moral and legal responsibility to put an end to the policies of aggression and to hold the occupying forces accountable for the forcible displacement and killing of Palestinians and the massive and collective punishment exacted thereby against Palestinians for decades. The failure by the Security Council to adopt a resolution regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza proves yet again that the international community has failed to take a stance regarding the perpetration by the occupying power of all those carnages. We call upon the Security Council to shoulder its responsibilities to put an end to the current Israeli practices and to adopt a ceasefire to put an end to this brutal aggression against the people of Gaza and to prevent the forcible displacement thereof and to guarantee the access of humanitarian aid to the people in Gaza. And we do want to recall and to remind you that every single minute of delay of shouldering this responsibility is equal to hundreds of casualties and destabilization. Tunisia holds fast to its position, namely the right of Palestinian people to establish their independent state on the entire land of Palestine with Jerusalem as its capital. And we do stress that security in the region should be based on comprehensive and just peace. Meanwhile, the right of the Palestinian people is not subject to the statute of limitations, and it could not lapse by way of killing and displacement on the part of the occupation and cutting off the most basic services, including water, medicine, food, electricity, and targeting innocent men, women, elderly, hospitals, relief, and first aid personnel. And we reiterate that justice should be served to the Palestinian people, this justice that is overdue by putting an end to the occupation and the restoration of the rights of the Palestinian people represented in the sovereign, independent Palestinian state and put an end to this humanitarian injustice that has lasted for decades. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Tunisia for their statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Algeria.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
President, I want to congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month. In recent months and years, we have consistently warned against the potential deterioration of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. This ongoing cycle of violence results from the absence of a political solution to the Palestinian question and the dire conditions in which generation of Palestinians are forced to leave. We must put an end to this ongoing tragedy in Gaza. During these last 10 days, the civilian population in the Gaza Strip is under airstrikes with no area can be a safe shelter. This is not a war against Hamas, but a war against Palestinian civilians, children, women, and elderly. More than 60% of the casualties are among children and women. Mr. President, first, Algeria strongly condemned the deliberate attack on civilians in the Gaza Strip by the occupying forces, resulting in thousands of casualties. We condemn also, in the strongest word, the airstrike against the Ahli Anglican Hospital that resulted on the death of nearly 500 civilians. There can be no justification for targeting hospitals, clinics, medical personnel, and UN facilities. International law protects this critical infrastructure. We should strongly condemn any violation of these rules. No one is above the law. Attempts to absolve the occupying power of responsibility for such acts are unacceptable. Secondly, it is imperative to adequately address the humanitarian needs of the affected population. We must ensure unimpeded humanitarian access to the Gaza Strip. The occupying power should lift its siege and collaborate with UN humanitarian agencies. It must also rescind its order to evacuate the northern area of Gaza. Third, any attempt to equate the Palestinian people and the occupying power is unacceptable. What we are witnessing today is an assault on a defenseless Palestinian population, a crime against humanity. Mr. President, in conclusion, I want to reiterate the solidarity and support of the Algerian people to the Palestinian people. Faced to the rapid deterioration of the humanitarian on the ground, the Council should not remain silent. We regret